Hello, welcome to Raymond Castile's Basement of Horror. Today we're going to talk about the shock monster. What's a shock monster? Well, this is a shock monster. This is a shock monster. That's a shock monster. That's a shock monster. I sound like Oprah saying, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, everybody gets a car. Well, you don't get a shock monster. I'm sorry. I can't give everyone a shock monster. As you can see, I hardly have any shock monsters, so I don't have enough to give out. But what is this thing called a shock monster? Now, I don't know if you can see it, but I've had a plaque on the wall back here, I think since the beginning of the show, that is the shock monster. It's the famous design by Keith Ward. The shock monster was originally called Horror. It was a rubber Halloween mask produced by a company called Topstone, originally in 1954. The company, Topstone, was founded in 1946. It went through a variety of names like Topstone Rubber Toy Company, Topstone Industries. Today, collectors just refer to it as Topstone. The company changed hands a few times. It was sold to Paper Magic Group in the mid-1990s, and then to Gemmy. I never know if it's Gemmy or Gemmy. I think it's Gemmy. And then more recently, it was purchased by Trick or Treat Studios. So all the associated IPs for the Topstone company are now owned by Trick or Treat Studios. They own the licensing, the trademarks for all the characters, all the associated intellectual property for Topstone. And they're going to be putting out some updated Topstone masks in the months to come. The shock monster is probably the most iconic Topstone mask. But as I said, it wasn't really called shock monster, it was called Horror. The original name that Topstone gave that mask was Horror. Horror. It was James Warren, the publisher of Famous Monsters of Filmland, that called it the shock monster. He coined that name, and in advertisements in Famous Monsters, that mask was called Shock Monster. And I think to monster kids today, it's best known through the Captain Company mail order pages in Famous Monsters of Filmland. But, you know, I never saw a shock monster. I was never aware of seeing a shock monster as a child. I was aware of Topstone masks. I wasn't aware they were called Topstone, but I was aware of the masks because every Halloween I looked forward to seeing those rubber masks in the wire bins at Kmart or Ben Franklin or whatever. And there were several I liked. My favorite was the Graveyard Devil, which at the time I didn't know it was called the Graveyard Devil, but that's the name of the character. But there were all kinds of other Topstone masks that I really liked. But I never pulled up a shock monster and said, I like this one. I guess it just didn't speak to me. I don't even remember seeing it. I must have seen it because I saw all of them, but I don't remember that one. I remember the odd ones, like the one, like the wolf head one and the one with the lumps, and definitely the teenage werewolf. I had that one. I had a few of them, but I don't remember the shock monster making an impression on me as a child, which is strange. I'm sure I saw the ads. I saw the ads for like the Teenage Werewolf mask and the Gorilla and Caveman masks. Those were advertised in Famous Monsters, but also in comic books. And my childhood Teenage Werewolf mask actually came through a comic book ad. My grandmother ordered that for me. I didn't buy that at the store. So I don't have a memory of the shock monster from childhood. But certainly once I became an adult and I got into the monster collecting scene, shock monster was everywhere. It's an iconic character. And really, when I talk about the shock monster, I'm talking about a character more than a mask. There is a, I mean, it started with a mask designed by Keith Ward, 1950s, produced by Topstone, but then it became its own thing over the decades. And that name that James Warren gave it, Shockmaster, that really immortalized it. I don't know if it would be as well known if he had kept that name Horror. Maybe, I don't know, because the design is so well known. But that name Shockmaster really stuck. I mean, that sums up that whole era, like the shock theater television package. It has that monster kid ring to it, Shockmaster. And it is a shocking mask. Now, I did a YouTube video 5 or 6 years ago, like a little mini documentary about the Shockmaster. And I'd done a whole series of Topstone little mini documentaries. It's called Tomb of the Topstones. That first one, the Shockmaster one, I didn't know what I was doing. I was improvising the whole thing. So if you watch that and you listen to it, I'm like, kind of like I'm doing when I meet with you here on the show. Same thing. I was just improvising all of that. I didn't have anything written down. I didn't know what I was doing. And you can tell when you listen to it that it's just somebody, I'm just telling you in real time everything I can think of saying about the Shockmaster. Later, as I continued to make those videos, I wrote a script and I did more research and it was more polished. Everything was more polished until the last couple, like the Mummy and the Hag and the Witch. I think those are pretty good. Those are nice little documentary pieces. Those early ones, though, are very rough. Now, there's some outdated information in the early ones, including the Shockmaster. I think I say in the Shockmaster video that it was made in 1955 or 56. And now I know that that's not true. It was 1954. Generally, the information in that video is still good. But if you watch that, and I recommend you watch it if you're interested in the Shockmaster, if you watch it, just remember some of that information is outdated. And if I were making it today, there are a few little things I would change, some extra information I'd add, some corrections I'd make. This video is not meant to replace that one. If you want the history of the Shockmaster, watch that video. This video is just showing you some cool masks. That's all I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to show you all the different Shockmasters that I can, just to give you an idea of how, and this doesn't even scratch the surface, just how popular that character is, how it's been depicted in mask form again and again and again through the years. Now let's see, what can we do here? Well, let's start with the actual Shockmaster. This is a mask made by VXX Effects. It's the company name of a mask maker named Daryl, and he made a lot of modern pulls of vintage Topstone masks. So he took the vintage master that Topstone actually used, made a new mold of it, a new plaster mold, and then made new modern latex pulls from those new molds. This was made from the original Topstone master. So this is not recreation. This is, it originated from Topstone's actual master. Now let's take a look at this. Well, maybe I'll hold it with this. And this was called the Deluxe Shock. VXX Effects he's made other Shockmaster masks besides this one. This was a limited edition deluxe version. Before this one, he made a recast of a vintage Shockmaster mask, an actual production example. Not from the master mold, but from one that he owned. He owned an old Shockmaster mask, and he made a mold of the actual mask, destroying the mask in the process. And then he released that as a mask, and that was in the 90s. This one I'm holding here is from the 2000s. This is from the original company master. So this is a much more detailed representation of the Shockmaster. This really captures Keith Ward's original sculpt in every detail. The original Topstone masks, they never look quite like this, although the ones from the 50s, they are pretty detailed. When you see old photos and film of those original 50s Topstone masks, they are pretty detailed. Maybe not this detail, but they're pretty detailed. And as the company went along over the years, and especially after Keith Ward left the company, he ran the company during the 50s and sculpted all the masks. When he left the company, when he sold it, the quality went down and the masks became less detailed, and molds were used and reused and reused until they were worn out. So the resulting masks were very soft looking. They lacked a lot of detail. They were very bubbly, and the paint job was very rushed. But those 50s masks, they look, based on the photos we have, and based on some 50s masks that I own, I do have some 50s Topstone masks. They're pretty detailed. Like the 50s ones that I own, they're very thick, very crisp. The paint is very carefully done. They're very nice looking. Then as you get into the 60s and 70s, they looked more like something that you would buy at Ben Franklin. But the early Topstone masks, they were more like magic shop, magic store type items, like something like Don Post masks, things you would have up on the wall. Like here's a picture that illustrates that. So they were considered a little more upscale than in the 50s than they were in the 60s and 70s when they became mail order items. They were never like a Don Post mask or a Distortions mask, but they were a little more upscale in the 50s. A little bit. And then they became, junk store items, mass-produced items. Now, the ones that Trick or Treat's going to make, I'm sure, are going to be upscale. But we'll talk more about that later. So here's what the original Shock looked like as far as the sculpture, like Keith Ward's original sculpture is concerned. And the 50s masks would have looked not far off from this. A little softer, not quite as detailed, but not, and the paint wouldn't be as detailed, but not a million miles from this. I'm going to save, and I do have original Topstone production masks, Shockmaster masks, but I'm going to save those, and we're going to look at some other ones. I'll save those for later. Okay, so what should we look at next? Well, let's look at some unofficial ones. Yeah, sure. Okay, here's a West German Shockmaster. This is an example of how that character was repurposed and reused again and again. Not just for masks, but there have been toys and novelties and things that have unofficially used the Shockmaster, and there have been plenty of T-shirts and there was a stock image company that was licensing out the Shockmaster image for years and years. But this is a vintage West German mask, probably 1960s. That's clearly copying the Shockmaster. It looks like they might have taken an original Shockmaster and turned it inside out to create this sculpt. I suspect that's what happened there. This is a cool mask. This is one of my early foam jobs. I foamed this, and I didn't finish the back like I would have later, where I would have put latex over the back and done it a little more fancy, but this is one of my very, very early foam jobs. He's cool. I like him. Very crude, but it's definitely a Shockmaster. This is also a West German mask. Very different. Does not look the same. But it is a West German shockmaster. Unauthorized, unlicensed. But that just goes to show you how, even back in the 60s, how famous that image was. So companies wanted to cash in on that. They wanted their shockmaster. This mask was used in an old film called, in English, I think it's The Woman Hater or The Woman Killer. People think that that movie used a Topstone shockmaster. It didn't. It used this mask. But it used that mask. Now, let's see. Well, let's continue with bootleg shocks. This is a Fun World 1970s bootleg knockoff shockmaster. And you know I like Fun World. If you watched my Fun World episode, I collect Fun World stuff. So I really love anything made by Fun World. Blah. And I have the card for him. That's the card. So he would have been in a bag that would have fit between this cardboard. He would have been folded flat in there. Obviously, Star Wars era, cashing in on science fiction, trying to make it seem like an alien. See some of the other aliens there. I showed this mask on a previous episode, a Fun World episode. Back you go. And you know, yeah, take a look at this before I go here. Look at that. So Fun World took an actual Topstone shockmaster, and it was probably rotting to pieces, and they used it to make this. Just like that other West German one, they probably turned it inside out because the bulging eye is on the wrong side. So they probably turned it inside out to produce that. And I'm just thinking, let me look at this. See that? I mean, clearly they had some old rotting mask, turned it inside out, and made that. Though I suspect the reason this part is torn away is because that's where the Keith Ward logo would have been. There would be a stamp that said a Keith Ward creation. I don't know if it's probably on that. I'm not going to check it out to see. So let's look at this one. Not this one. We already looked at that one. This one. This is an artist mask. So this is not mass produced. This is made in a small run. I mean, this is an artist mask, even though it's originated from a Topstone master. This is an artist mask that was an original sculpt. And I believe this is Casey Love. If it's not Casey Love, then I'll dub in the right artist, and it'll be like a Japanese movie. My mouth will be saying Casey Love, and then my voice will be saying some other name. But I think this is Casey Love. That's the sculptor who made this. And this shockmaster is meant to look like Vincent Price in Madhouse. So it's a shockmaster, but his makeup, he's wearing the makeup that Vincent Price wore in Madhouse. So it's both a Vincent Price item and a shockmaster item. Pretty neat. Now I'm curious if he's signed it. Just me see here. I would think it's signed. Yep, there it is, it's signed. It's signed. So that's Casey Love. I bought this a long time ago. I've had that a long, long time. And ordinarily, I have these things packed away. Like this VXX shock. He's in a plastic bag, and the plastic bag is tucked underneath him. And he came with a certificate of authenticity. So that's in a protective bag with a backer card. And then he's on top of that, and it's in a closet. So I don't normally have it on a stand or out in the open. Let's start looking at, before we go back to like the real Topstone shocks, let's look at other masks that people have made based on the Shockmaster. Okay. This is probably the biggest Shockmaster you're ever going to see. Goodness gracious. Woo. Oh, goodness. Get him out of there. Okay. Is he still in one piece? Yeah. So this is a Dynamic Design. Dynamic Design International Schlock Monster. This was called a Schlock Monster. That's a big old mask. I don't even know if you're really supposed to wear that. I think it's more of a display piece, but it's a big mask. I have to get it way back here so you can see the whole thing. But it's humongous. You see that detail. And here's the tag. Dynamic Design International. And that character looks like a Disney Haunted Mansion ghost. I don't know if that's what it is. I'm just assuming the font kind of looks like Haunted Mansion, so I'm guessing that's the inspiration. Is this? I don't think this has eye holes. It's got holes in the nostrils, so I don't know if this is really meant to be worn or not. It has a kind of chalky look, and it had that when it was new, so I don't think it's not mold or anything like that. It was always like that. It has a kind of grayed out look. Sun Valley, California, 2002. This mask was made in 2002. Now, I'm sorry if it seems like I rushed through Topstone history. Like I said, watch that Shockmaster video. If you want the history of the mask and the company, watch that series, Tomb of the Topstones. Watch those videos, and because this is not meant to be a history of the company or a comprehensive history of the mask. This is just showing you cool Shockmasters. That's what I'm doing here. Put him back in this. Oh, don't rip the tag. He's hard to take care of because he's so big. Any collectible, if it's big, whether it's a toy, paper product, a mask, display piece, the bigger it is, the harder it is to take care of it. Hard to store, hard to preserve, hard to keep it from being damaged. Okay, where will I put him? I will put you. Okay, now, are you with me still? Haven't left me? Here is a bump in the night shock monster. You're going to see some bagged ones like this. These are all the original factory bags, shipped in that bag from the factory. I haven't looked at this in years, and I guess I really should have this stuffed with plastic on a stand, but it's a little warped. So there's the Bump in the Night Productions shock monster. It looks a lot like that schlock we just saw. It's much smaller. It's Bump in the Night. You notice it has blue hair. So did the schlock. I'll talk about the hair later. Very bulgy, eye sticking way out. Very exaggerated, much like the schlock. Very exaggerated, kind of cartoony, kind of conveying what you think the mask looks like, what it looks like in your memory, not so much what the actual mask looked like. Trying to fill it out with my fingers here. There we go. That looks pretty good. Bump in the Night Productions shock monster. Pretty cool. Now, one thing I noticed with this guy, he's got this skeletal eye hole. That's kind of different. I don't remember if the schlock we just saw had that, but that's not like the original mask, that skeletal big eye hole. That's Keith Ward's sculpt doesn't have that, so that's an original element on this. I think this is 2003. Where's my magnifying glass? See, what you don't know is I just shoved around an original Topstone shock monster, like, trying to get this magnifying glass. This is much more important than the vintage shock monster, but whatever. 2003 Bump in the Night Productions. Okay, so the schlock was 2002, and this is 2003. So I kind of see a resemblance. Not that I'm saying one copied the other, but I think that there was something sort of in the air at the time. There was an idea what a shock monster ought to look like, and some independent artist renditions had a similarity about them. So there's an unauthorized shock monster. All these companies I'm showing, they didn't get permission from somebody to do these things. They treated the character as public domain. That's a whole other discussion. I don't want to get into that. But Topstone, they were not very good at protecting their copyrights. Even when the company was still around, in the late 80s and 90s, there were people making t-shirts and stuff with the characters on them, and Topstone didn't police that. And certainly after it was sold, nobody was policing it. It was the Wild West. Let's save that for a second. All right, here's a couple of... Is this the... That's Justin's. Is this Don Post? That's Don Post. Okay. Let's look at this. This is a Don Post. Don Post actually made a shock monster. This is a Don Post shock. Is it 2012? 2011. So near the end of the original Don Post's existence, and by the way, Trick or Treat Studios also owns Don Post now. Don Post was sold, and eventually Trick or Treat, not just in the last year, Trick or Treat bought it. But this is in 2011, so the old Don Post more or less was still in business. It wasn't exactly the old Don Post, but that's another story. But legally, officially, the old Don Post was still in business, and this is a Don Post mask, and this is a shock monster. And since Don Post was owned by Jimmy, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and I don't know the chain of ownership, like if Don Post was sold to Paper Magic and they were sold to Jimmy, I know Topstone. I don't know the history of Don Post and who owned what over time. But a year after this was made, Don Post was shut down. And it was not because Don Post Jr. wanted it shut down. It was because the people who owned the company, he didn't own it. The people who owned the company shut it down and got rid of everybody. I remember the day because it was the weekend of Mask Fest, the convention, and it was that, I guess that Friday that everyone found out, that including the Don Post people. That was a sad day. But now Trick or Treat Studios owns it, so we'll see what happens there. Anyway, so because the same company that had bought Topstone, or bought the company that bought Topstone, also owned Don Post thought that they then had the legal right to produce a licensed official shock monster. So they promoted this as the first official shock monster since the original Topstone version. Now there's some complications there. I'm not going to get into details on that, but I'll briefly mention it in just a minute. It wasn't quite as simple as that. But you see that it's also got that wide eye, like a skull almost. That's different from the original Topstone version. This, it's a nice mask, but it's kind of, it's kind of comical. It has a sort of a comic book sort of look. It's very much in keeping with those other two masks we just saw, the schlock, the dimensional design, or the dynamic design, and the bump in the night. It's very much in keeping with that style, with where those companies were going. Now, Don Post did another one. This was their economy shock. Now, this is Paper Magic Group. You see the Paper Magic Group logo up there. That's the economy shock monster. Released at the same time, 2011. Also Don Post. Like I said, I don't know the chain of ownership. I think Don Post was sold to Paper Magic, as was Topstone, and Paper Magic was sold to Gemmy, and then Gemmy sold both of them to Trick or Treat Studios some years later, I think. You want to know the real story? Watch Tomb of the Topstones. I did no research before I sat down here. I didn't look up anything, or I just sat down and started talking. So watch those videos. Tomb of the Topstones. Those are more authoritative. But this is, and it's confusing. Is it Paper Magic? Is it Don Post? Is it Gemmy? Who the heck made this mask? But at the time, it was promoted as a Don Post mask. Like this was the economy version, and the previous one I held up was the deluxe version. And the deluxe version was marketed as a Don Post mask, and the economy version was marketed as a Paper Magic Group mask. All right, let's get both of these out of here. I'm being very rough with these masks. Okay, this is a Trick or Treat Studios mask, but it's not the new ones that are coming out. This is an old one. And again, like all of these this is the original factory plastic. That all these masks, these modern masks, are still in their original factory plastic. I've never taken them out. This is probably the first time I've taken some of these out. I bought them because I just wanted shock monsters, hey. And I guess I had some vision of someday having a display of shock monsters, but I never did that. I don't display anything. So this is by Trick or Treat Studios. I don't know the first year Trick or Treat put out a shock monster, but Justin Mabry, one of the people who runs Trick or Treat Studios and their main sculptor, he made a shock monster on his own, put it out under his own company, and then later it became a Trick or Treat Studios product. And this is not one of his early ones. This is a Trick or Treat Studios mask. But he made one that predated this. Essentially the same mask, but it was made as an independent artist mask. This is called Shock, just Shock, not Shock Monster. And for a year. It's made in Mexico, which is where they make all their masks. I don't know what year they started making that. It could be on the mask somewhere. Let's see here. But I know that Trick or Treat Studios has a trademark on the shock monster that predates buying the Topstone IPs. So they've had a trademark on the shock monster before Dom Post made their shock monster. So that's where there's some, it's a little gray as about whether that Dom Post mask was the first official license thing. Yeah, I don't want to get into that. But let's just say Justin and Trick or Treat Studios, they had a trademark on the shock monster before Dom Post made their shock monster. And this is a Trick or Treat Studios shock monster, sculpted by Justin Mabry. And this is essentially the same shock monster mask they make today. I don't think they're planning on changing this. I don't know. They could certainly make one now that's more like the Keith Ward design. I don't know if they plan to do that or not. But this one's been out for years and years and years. Over a decade. And it's a very modern looking shock monster. It takes the Keith Ward design and it modernizes it and makes it look a little more realistic. It's more like what a contemporary mask customer would want to buy. Not an old weirdo like me, I want to buy something that looks like that. Well, or like these. I like cheesy old production examples that were made on a factory assembly line by underpaid sweatshop workers and just painted hastily. Okay, so there is a collection of modern, mass-produced, more or less, modern shock monsters. All right, what should I show you next? Oh, I should have showed you the Ben Cooper masks. We're a little bit out of sequence, but just again to show you how widespread this character was. In the 60s, Ben Cooper made knockoff plastic vacuum form shock monster masks for their Halloween costumes, not just the masks themselves, although they did that too, but they made shock masks that were sold in boxes with costumes. One was supposed to be the Phantom of the Opera, and the other I think was a pirate, like, I don't know if they called him Blackbeard or what they, or it was some kind of a pirate. That was the idea. But it's the shock monster. They're both shock monsters. So they made those. You should at this moment be looking at an image of these two boxed Ben Cooper shock monster masks. And in addition to those, they made at least one shock monster that was kind of an orange color that was not part of a costume or a box. It was just sold on its own. And I guess that's a good segue talking about vacuform shock monsters. And this kind of also serves as a segue into the official Topstone products. Should I do that or, yeah, okay. Well, no, let's hold off on that. Let's wait. Let's do this first. Let's go into, these are official Topstone shock monsters, but they are 80s resculpts. I'm going to go backward in time with these and work my way back to the Keith Ward versions. Okay. This is probably a Sri Lanka Topstone shock monster. It's not marked Topstone, but the Topstone masks that Paper Magic Group made after they bought the company, they did make some Topstone masks after they bought the company. They did produce some Topstone masks, and they produced some that actually said Topstone on the mask. But most of them, from what we know today, from what evidence there is out there, most of the ones that they produced in the late 90s just said made in Sri Lanka. It didn't say Topstone. This I don't think has any markings at all. But I think this is a late 90s Sri Lanka, in quotes, Topstone. When I bought this, I just thought it was another knockoff shock like those West German ones. And it could be. It might not be Paper Magic Group. But when I got this other one, that's when I realized, oh, this must be actual Topstone. But probably late 90s, that's why it's not marked. This originally glowed in the dark. All over. The whole thing glowed in the dark. And it looks weird because this was a very, very early attempt at mask preservation. This thing was rotting to smithereens, and I think you can kind of see the edges there. This thing was in bad shape. And I used Mod Podge. Now, it was already glossy. It had a glossy surface. But I used, I mean, it's glossy now because of the Mod Podge, but even before that, it was glossy. It had a glossy paint. I used Mod Podge to try to preserve it. I didn't know about foaming. I really didn't know what foaming was all about. I didn't know how to preserve these things. I was just desperate for any way. And then when I found out about foaming, I sent some masks to Mascahuna to get foamed for the first time. And I also tried to foam some myself. And this is one of the very first ones I ever foamed. You know, probably a third or fourth mask I ever foamed. Again, not finished the way I would have done later. But, you know, not bad, really. I mean, if I do say so myself, not bad. It's held up better than some more recent ones I foamed. It seems like my foaming has gotten worse over the years. Some of these early ones turned out pretty good. And I like the way his jaw has that, like a broken jaw, sort of. It's kind of angled and jutting out like that. He's hard as a rock, but he was already turning hard when I foamed him. And I didn't have any idea how to handle bulging eyes like this at the time. This was a very, very early attempt at foaming, so I'm much better now. But, you know, it's not bad. It's held up all these years. It's still here. As far as I know, this never glowed. So this one looks like the same mask, but it's not. This is official Topstone. It's got, you probably can't see it, but it has Topstone markings on the bottom. Topstone Industries. And, yeah, I foamed this one too. A little more finished on the back. I foamed that. Didn't Mod Podge it. By the time I got this, I knew a thing or two about foaming. And he's held up pretty well. Knock on wood. You're going to see one that has not held up well in just a minute. This is probably late 80s or, oh gosh, probably later than that, probably early 90s. I've never seen this version of the shock in a catalog. I'm going to show you the one that I know is an 80s shock that turns up in late 80s Topstone catalogs. I've never seen a catalog image of this one, but this is a Topstone mask. It's official Topstone with Topstone Industries, Danbury, Connecticut stamped on its chin. The early ones say Keith Ward Creation on the top, or maybe somewhere else, or they say Topstone Rubber Toy Company. The later ones, after Keith Ward sold the company, much later, is really the 80s, 90s Topstones, say Topstone Industries, Danbury, Connecticut. And that's what this one says. So this is an actual Topstone mask. And you even from the side, that's a nice shock monster profile. Look at that. That looks like a shock monster. Yeah, maybe not that way, but that's a shock monster. Look at that. So he's a shock monster for sure, but he's not the Keith Ward shock monster. And if I'm confusing you, because I really didn't talk about the changes Topstone made to the mold over time. Obviously, Keith Ward sculpted the original shock monster. Then Keith Ward sold the company, but Topstone continued to make Keith Ward designs for 20 years after they bought the company, after the new owners bought the company. And then in the 80s, for some reason, they dropped the Keith Ward sculpts and they re-sculpted all the characters. And from then on until the end of the company, when it was sold to Paper Magic, they produced new sculpts based on the Keith Ward characters. And these new sculpts, most of them are very crude. They don't have the finesse of the Keith Ward versions. Okay, so now let's look at one that has not held up very well. This is the 80s shock that you see in catalogs, in Topstone company catalogs. This is a 80s resculpt Topstone shock monster. But he's not supposed to be that color. He has turned brown. That, see on the edge there, that's the color he originally was. He turned brown. And a lot of 80s Topstone masks will turn brown. They'll become brittle, so if they're not foamed, they'll just fall to pieces. If they are foamed, they still turn brown. Not all of them. It's kind of random which ones you can have, and this has happened to me. I'll have multiples of the same character, same sculpt, same 80s era, and they may all be foamed, but one will turn brown, one won't. It might turn hard, but not turn brown. This is turned hard, and if it turns brown, it's turned hard. But sometimes they turn hard and they don't change color. I like that, because once they turn hard, whatever they look like is the way they're going to look. They're frozen then. Once it's turned hard, if it hasn't become discolored, that's a good thing. That means it's going to stay that way probably forever. So I don't mind when they're foamed and they turn hard. I mind when they change colors like this. Now this one was foamed by Mascahuna, so you can see the difference in what a professional foam job looks like. Much smoother. This foam is a lot softer, so he takes an electric carving knife and cuts that. I couldn't do that with the foam I use. It's much too hard. This foam has a little bit of give to it. It's not spongy like a Nerf ball, but it has a little bit of give. So that is an 80s shock, discolored. They also made kind of an avocado green shock. I've had one in the basement, so to speak, and I photographed it. I foamed one for somebody, and his, last I heard, is still holding up just great. I've seen recent photos of it. So that one's still going strong, but I've never actually owned one. So I've had my hands on one. I've had one here for a while, but it didn't belong to me, and eventually I had to let go of it and give it back to its owner. So I've never had the dark green version, but there is a version, same sculpt, but a dark green, not exactly the same color as this brown green, more like an avocado, more like this, you know, closer to that color, a little darker than that. This has a bit of blue in it. Now, let's see another example of this. Hopefully this hasn't turned brown since the last time I looked at it. Okay, so here is the same mask we just looked at. That's what it's supposed to look like. That's its original color. Isn't that beautiful? I love those 80s, early 90s Topstone colors. It's a shame they don't last. They just look like they're made of candy. But so many of them turn brown. It's really a shame. That is an 80s shock monster. It's resculpted. They probably took an original Keith Ward and sculpted over it to make this. I'm just guessing. Nobody knows exactly why they resculpted all these masks in the 80s, or exactly how they did it. I can speculate. There's a few different reasons that might have happened, but one reason is they moved production overseas. So these things used to be made in the United States, and they moved production overseas. They might have thought it was easier to just resculpt all the masks overseas instead of shipping masters overseas. They might have just packed production examples, like, you know, rubbery mask, packed them flat, and shipped them to wherever the factory was, and said, okay, here, recreate this, and this is what they got. That's just a theory. There was also some legal things going on around the late 70s, early 80s with the company, and there might have been some reason why they wanted maybe the old sculpts. I'm really speculating. I hate to put up misinformation, but there was some legal things going on that might have played a part in wanting to have new sculpts that they were sure that they owned. But that's very speculative. Anyway, this is what that mask is supposed to look like. And I don't know how long this one's going to look like this. For a while, I hope. I don't know. I don't know if I'm going to foam that one. Lately, when I've been getting these 80s or any Topstone mask, I don't foam it. I just leave it like it is, because I'm just not sure with some of these if foaming is good for them. Like, would this have turned colors like this if it hadn't been foamed? Maybe, I don't know. I've had masks that were not foamed that changed color and fell apart because they weren't foamed. They had nothing to support them. So I just don't know. I think it's really just a roll of the dice. I think I could have 3 of the same mask, and one would stay okay, one would turn hard but not change color, one would turn hard and change color. And it's just random. I think it's just, you can't predict what's going to happen. So the solution is to have multiples of each character, which in many cases I do. So if one goes bad, I've got 1 or 2 more. Now, let's keep going back in time. Like the ones I just showed you are probably, well, I know they're, I think it's '85 is the earliest I've seen that mask. I know it's in the '89 catalog for sure. I think it's in '85 too. Don't quote me on that. I don't know about this one though. I think this has got to be '90s. I'm thinking, but I've never seen a catalog image of that one. Okay, now let's talk about Keith Ward. This version, Keith Ward shocks. Start getting into the Keith Ward original Topstone shock monsters. I was talking about the Ben Cooper vacuum mask, and I thought maybe I'd segue into these, but nah. I changed my mind. This is, here, it might be easier to hold it with this in it. That might be good. Okay, so this is an original Keith Ward vacuum Topstone shock monster. And this plastic isn't doing any good. This was originally 79 cents. This is a Topstone product. It's got the markings up there. This was produced by Topstone. They produced a lot of their rubber masks as plastic versions, including the shock monster. And look at that ear. The early shock monsters, the ones with black hair, had an ear that turned over like this and folded down. And then later they changed that and got rid of that undercut. But this is the original Keith Ward sculpt. Because it's plastic, it's got all the detail intact. Original Topstone paint. I don't know if it ever had hair. I don't think it did. I'm going to show you one that did and still does have hair, but this one I don't think had hair. I don't think it was sold with hair. And I think the one I'm holding in my hand is the older of the two I'm going to show you. But look at that. So that is like having a master or one of the modern pulls, but it's vintage. I mean, it's got all the detail of a modern pull, but it's vintage. This is probably 1960s. And I say that because of the ear. They changed this ear around 1970. That's when they switched from the black hair to the blue hair. I believe that's when they changed that ear. They revised the shock circa 1970. So look at that. That is Keith Ward's original sculpt. Vintage production example shock monster. Now, oh, and look at how they preserve the sculpt of the eye. See, one eye is squinty and the other eye is open, the bulging eye. So they didn't mess with that. They didn't make both the eyes open wide. Let me put him back. Billy is sitting over there. He's staring at this, so he might jump up here. I wish he would. I don't want him to destroy my shock monsters, but I miss the days when he would always jump up on the table. And I think people enjoyed seeing that. Okay, here's another vintage Topstone production example. Keith Ward shock monster. Now, look at that. That's the original hair, and it's cut more like a half head mask, so you lose a lot of the ears and some of that back of the head detail. It's cut more like a Ben Cooper mask. painted very differently. I've got some plastic in here. Let me take that out. But you know, look at this. It's still got that. The eyes are cut the same way. They still haven't widened one of the eyes. They've preserved that sculpt, which I appreciate. That really makes it look like a shock monster. But this is a little bit glossier looking. It's a more fun looking shock. And this hair is really cool. There are, well, the late 1970s Lagoon monsters have hair like this, as do many other 70s Topstone masks. But if you see a Lagoon monster with hair like this, that's very likely a late 1970s Lagoon monster. And my friend Rudy Muniz has one that has blue and red hair. And the blue hair is just like the blue hair that was on the 70s shock monsters. And the red hair is just like this. So that tells me this is a 70s mask. Because that's when Topstone started using this kind of hair. The earlier haired Topstone masks, they have different hair. The hair is very different. From the 50s to the 60s to the 70s to the 80s. If you were trying to restore a mask, you could not take hair from one decade and stick it on a mask from another decade. It's not going to look right, or it's not going to be authentic. So this is 70s hair. And if this mask had been released in the 60s, it would have different hair. If it had been released in the 90s, it would have different hair. This is 70s hair. This is a very fun looking mask. The other one I just showed you is a little more serious, and it's better for seeing the detail of the original sculpt. And this is just a fun child's mask that you could wear to trick-or-treating. I like them both. It's good to have both. I wanted to show you that ear so you understand what I'm talking about with the ears. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a vintage black-haired rubber shock monster. Here's a picture of one. The mask you're looking at is now in the collection of Kirk Hammett. Unfortunately, he had it repainted. I don't know why he did that. I was disappointed to see that. He had it repainted. I think the original paint looked just fine. But anyway, that's the only black-haired rubber shock monster that I've ever seen on the collector market. But the black-haired shocks should have that bent-over ear, like on this plastic one. Now, here on this one, the master that we have today has an ear like that. It doesn't bend over like that one we just saw, or like the black-haired ones. And I think they made that change because of the undercut. I think that was causing problems, you know, taking it out of the mold. So they just fixed that. When they changed the hair color, I think that's probably when they changed that detail. Because they introduced the blue, as far as I can tell, based on catalogs and photos and everything, they introduced the blue-haired shock monster in 1970. I think that was the premiere of the blue-haired one, and that's probably when they changed the ear. You have to make a lot of best guesses with Topstone. There's not a lot of documentation. Okay, now we're going to see some vintage rubber Keith Ward shock monsters. I'm going to snap my fingers, and they're going to magically appear. Are you ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Here we are. Original, vintage, latex rubber, Topstone, Keith Ward, shock monsters. Okay, let's look at the white-haired one first. How you doing? That is a Keith Ward sculpt, vintage, original, probably 1970s, shock monster. I have to be very careful with him because he has turned hard, but he has not discolored. He's hard as a cracker, but he's the original color. His color has not changed, thank goodness. So hopefully he'll stay the way he is forever, I hope. I don't mind when they turn hard, I mind when they change colors. You can really see that original Keith Ward sculpt. It's covered with hair a bit, but yeah, you can see it. And this says a Keith Ward creation under the hair up here. Now this, they did cut this eye wide, the one that's usually squinty. He's cut wide. The other eye had a bit more of a bulge, but it's kind of folded over on itself and then hardened that way. But it didn't stick out as much as it could have. They did cut some of it off. He has a beard. There's a whole series of Topstones, and I've got some others like that that have these beards. I don't know what year that was. I haven't seen a catalog that has these bearded ones. For some reason, I feel like this is bicentennial era, because there's something, vaguely Uncle Sam-like about this, with the white hair and the white beard. And I'm just guessing way out there that there might have been a bunch of Uncle Sam type masks around that time. They might have wanted to convert this to look similar to that, thinking that might help sell it. But then I've got some other bearded Topstones that are, they don't look like Uncle Sam. They don't have white. They have gray or black hair. And this hair is rooted. It's not glued on. And that might indicate even later. I don't know. I don't know what year this is. But it's definitely a Keith Ward shock monster. It's not a resculpt. That's the original sculpt. This base is a little wobbly. Now this foam is Mascahuna. Nice professional foam. And the base and everything, that's his work. But this wood warps over time, no matter who does it. I mean, the ones I've done, the one anyone does. And I'm just worried about this. That I don't know how sturdy the whole thing is. And because it's turned hard, if it ever gives way and this thing falls over, yeah, I'm in trouble. Well, yeah, I'm in trouble. Now, this other one I'm going to show you, this is iconic. This is the blue-haired shock monster. So this would have been introduced, I think, in 1970, based on the evidence we have. And if you see images of shock monsters from around that time, they've got blue hair. If you watch the Night Gallery episode from the early 70s, where there's a kid in a shock monster mask, it looks just like this. All the images of shock monsters from that time look just like this. And the blue hair has really become the iconic look for the shock monster. You've seen some of these other ones that you've seen, they painted the hair blue. I've got some other representations of the shock monster, both independent artist items and also mass-produced items that have blue hair. So the blue hair has become the default color for the shock monster's hair in modern times. It just looks unique. It's cool. There he is. That is the real deal Keith Ward Topstone shock monster. That is the no excuses, honest to gosh shock monster. He's got his squinty little eye and his bulging eye intact. Everything just the way it should be. His beautiful blue hair from the 1970s. Like I said, Rudy Muniz has a lagoon monster that's got half hair like this and half hair like that red-haired shock I showed you a few minutes ago. And when you see Topstones with hair like that, those are from the 70s. Those are not 60s. Those are from the 70s. And this is from the 70s. And I was going to say I'm from the 70s. That's not true. I'm from the 60s, I guess. But I identify with the 70s. I grew up in the 70s. But actually I was born in the 60s. Now this beautiful fellow was phoned by Creature Kid, Adam Doherty, and he put this, I think it's felt. Oh, maybe not. Is it? Yeah, it's fabric. It's black fabric on the back. I think it's felt. And I think this is wood, and this base is just heavy. It's very heavy. I believe the shaft is has a screw in it, so it's a very substantial base. I'm getting, it has a lot of dust. I'm getting fingerprints all over it. Let's just continue to enjoy this shock monster. This is, if you don't collect these, you probably can't appreciate what you're seeing right now. This is kind of an amazing thing. For a mask that was so ubiquitous, so widely produced for so many years, you would think that these things would be common. It would be easy to find one of these. I mean, you can find, let's say, a Tor Johnson mask, you know, Don Post. You can find the skulls, I mean, those are vinyl, and actually, come to think of it, the Tor Johnson masks that you find are mostly vinyl, so that probably explains it right there. But there are other masks that were common in their day that are easier to find, but you just cannot find a shock monster of any kind. There's only one other, there's only one black one, as I stated before. Kirk Hammett has that. After I bought this, a few years later, another blue-haired one did turn up, but I think the eyes are cut wide on that one, so it's not quite the same, probably a later one. And I know George, who runs the Facebook Topstone group, he has a white one, a white-haired one. There might be another white-haired one out there. I think the one I'm holding is the only blue-haired one that has the eyes with the original cut. And that's important. That really gives it that classic shock monster look. And if the eyes are cut wide, that means it's later when they started becoming more safety conscious in the late 70s, and especially in the 80s, but even in the late 70s, they were already cutting the eye holes wider and wider. Is he in focus? I hope so. Just trying to give you a long look at that. now I was talking about the ear. You can see he's got that later ear. And you can see it a little better on the white-haired one. I think you can see it better on this one. Yeah, see, they're just like the Master and the VXX one, exactly the same. But not like that earlier vacuum form one I showed that had the ear bending over. And as far as I know, any black-haired Keith Ward shock is going to have that bent over ear. And any blue or white one is going to have the later ear. I'm sure this blue one's 70s, this white one's probably 70s. And the black-haired ones are 50s and 60s. I would love to find... Oh, and they probably still made some black-haired ones in the 70s too. I'm like, that one that turned up looks kind of like a 70s mask, just from the paint and everything. But in the 50s and 60s, I don't think there were any other colors for shock except the black hair. And they started getting into the other colors in the 70s. So here we have vintage Keith Ward rubber, latex rubber shock monsters. Quite a sight. Very rare for some reason. I don't know why they're so rare, but they are. Very rare. Only one other blue one that I know of, and I think it has the eyes cut wider. And one other white one that I know of in the hands of the collector who found all of the Topstone masters that everyone uses to make these modern Topstone pulls like the VXX one. George is the guy who collected those masters. And he's the only other person that I know has a white-haired one. At the time I got these two, nobody had one. And for years, nobody else had a Keith Ward shock monster. But you know, over the years, if you're the only person who has something, you have it long enough, eventually other ones will turn up. And I'm sure more will turn up. I'm sure more blue ones and more white ones, and hopefully more black-haired ones will turn up. And I hope I get a black-haired one. I want all three. I want the blue, the black, the white. I want all three shock colors. I don't know how I'm going to get that black-haired one. I mean, maybe I'll just luck out and get a good deal on it. I don't know. But if it's someone who knows what they've got, that's going to be very difficult for me to obtain. It was difficult to obtain this, let me tell you. But I had to have this. I paid quite a bit for this, and if I hadn't, I probably would have just sold my collection, at least my Topstone collection. It was just like, if I don't own this, what am I even doing this for? This is the centerpiece of my Topstone collection. And there was just no point in having a Topstone collection if I were going to let this go. So it really was either I get it or I sell my entire collection. That was my thinking. There was just no point in having a collection, a Topstone collection, and letting this slip through my fingers. So there was just no way I was going to let this go. I'm glad I've got it. I'd like to have the black-haired one. I don't think Kirk Hammett's going to sell me the black-haired one. And anyway, he repainted it. What the heck? I mean, come on. How do you repaint something like that? Okay, well, I think we've reached the climax. Do you feel climaxed? I feel climaxed. How about you? All right. Billy's been around, and I was sure he would jump up here and destroy these, but he hasn't done that. When I snapped, he went, psst, ran. I think that's it. Did I miss anything? Did I leave out anything? I don't think so. I don't know if you've been able to see this. There we go. I've had this plaque on the wall throughout this series, since I started the show. That's the original Keith Ward illustration of the Shock Monster. And you see it has blue hair. Now that's not the way Keith Ward drew it, but this this plaque, this rendition, has blue hair. And like I said, these days, if someone's presenting the Shock Monster in some kind of artwork or whatever, some kind of product they're making, they usually give it blue hair. That's become the stock look for the Shock Monster because it's very arresting. It's, you know, it's different. No one has naturally blue hair. That is automatically a supernatural, monstrous color. Why does this thing have blue hair? It doesn't make any sense, which is why it's cool. There we go. I hope you enjoyed this. Again, this is not supposed to be a comprehensive history of Topstone or the Shock Monster. This is just me showing you some Shock Monsters. So I hope you had fun. That's it. Until next time, the one who dies with the most toys is dead.